So good morning, How's everybody doing? My name is Dan Quinn. I'm an assistant professor and corn agronomist for Purdue in Indiana. So they brought up a I-State guy so you guys can throw stuff at me or tell us we don't know how to grow corn in the I-States. That's fine. Not as good as Illinois. We'll talk about it. I don't know what's going on in that state. You know, Indiana always gets lumped in with Illinois. It's very different. So I'm from Purdue. Cover the entire state of Indiana for corn. I'm originally from Michigan, so this latitude right here is right where I'm my hometown in Michigan. So I like coming up here. It's very similar to what I grew up with in terms of, you know, maturities and crop management and stuff like that. So I always like coming up here. Temperature is much better here than it was in Indiana the last couple days. Indiana was about 96 degrees Fahrenheit the last couple days. I think it's 90 today. So actually crops starting to shut down there. Our crops are a little bit more progressed down there, obviously, but some of the crops starting to shut down. I work with a couple cooperators in southern Indiana. They were combining last week. So one, they planted in March, but two, when you get those mid 90 degree temperatures, it's going to move that crop right along.
What's the yield?
What was the yield? They had 90 bushel soybeans and about 270 bushel corn. So, yeah, I gotta be quiet when I say those numbers. But southern Indiana is probably the best looking crop that you'll find. But yeah, they planted March 25th in the state, and they were combining last week. Yep. So I always give an update of the state of Indiana, just so I usually get groans when I talk about the yield estimates from this year. State record yield average for the state of Indiana again, 207 is what they predicted. That's the highest Indiana's ever had. Indiana's hit state record yields the last 3 out of 4 years. So really good yields. State of Indiana, if you cut it in half, kind of the western part of the state is probably the best in terms of overall condition and moisture. Eastern part of the state, even driving up northeast, looks pretty good. That typically is the area where we struggle in northeast Indiana. But east Indiana, we're actually getting tar spot in that state. That's the first time we've ever had tar spot in that area of the state, and it's pretty bad in that part of the state. So a lot of tar spot has been impacting things, and I think some of the really hot and some dry weather over the last week or so has impacted the crop. I had the comment about Illinois. Illinois state yield average, they're predicting 225 for a state, which is just ridiculous. But it's Illinois. They grow corn on top of 6 foot of topsoil over there. I've been in that state a couple times this year. The crop is probably the best I've seen in that state. And they just caught rain the last couple weeks. And then they caught rain, I think, a couple days ago as well. So in terms of finishing that crop, Iowa, I think, is 209. So I-States are not helping your prices. I'm sorry about that. That's just, you know, really good yields in the state. I think Michigan, I've done some meetings in Michigan the last week or so. I think Michigan's looking pretty good, depending on where you're at. I know they had some issues with some high moisture early on. But did want to give you a quick overview of where things are at from the I-States and my perspective. Overall, stuff looks pretty good. We'll see when the combines roll. So today I want to just talk about grain fill in corn. Kind of talk about how it's important, some of the work we've been doing in terms of tracking grain fill. A lot of the corn, regardless of where you're at right now, is in grain fill. Corn right behind you is filling grain. Pull these ears, kernel numbers are there, it's filling grain. Now we're starting to determine how big those kernels are going to be, what's the dry matter, what's the overall weight of those kernels. And kernel weight and the size of those kernels can swing yield quite a bit. Because you think, if I pulled these 2 ears, and I always ask people, which one would you rather have? And a lot of people are like, well, I want the one on the left. Well, I'd be really curious when the combine rolls through where they're at. Because this one was 22 around and it was about 36 long. And this one was 16 around, but 40 long. And look at the size of the kernels, the difference in the size of the kernels. Correct, right? So let's snap them in half. Take a look. So the depth of those kernels. So you maybe look at the depth, but you look at just how wide those kernels are. You know, the size of those kernels. So you think, well, man, I really want this year's, you know, it looks wider, it's got more kernels. Well, it probably might end up coming pretty close in terms of those yields. And that's a function of basically how big those kernels are and what the weight of those kernels. So this time of year, we pull a lot of ears, we count kernels, do your yield checks, you divide by a certain number. That fudge factor number, we always call it, that 90, that 85, that 75. That number comes from the weight of the kernels. That's where we decide that number. So if I use 75, divide by 75 to get my yield estimate, you know, you count your rows around, kernel number up, you multiply by your population, and you divide by a number. And it's often 90, 75, 85. That number comes from the weight of the kernels. So 75 just means that we have an estimate that there's 75,000 kernels per 56-pound bushel. So if I have bigger kernels, like this hybrid right here, bigger kernels, it might be 65, 70. I think that's what the Mazex folks told me they classify this one at. This one, maybe 80, 85, maybe a little bit higher. So that means 85,000 kernels per 56-pound bushel just means smaller kernels. So if you ever want to see how much the weight of kernels impact yield, just do a little math. I hate math, but that's all right. You just play with that number, see, move that number up and down, move it from 70 to 75 or 80 to 85 or 90, and see how much that yield estimate changes. And that's the weight and the size of those kernels. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of the weight of the kernels. And I like this data. This is some data from us and some data from Iowa. We're still trying to update this, but it's kind of across the board, different hybrids and stuff like that. It probably would differ a little bit with hybrids and environment, but it gives you an idea that when we pull an ear at dent, so if you pull an ear, it's R5. R5 growth stage is dent. And when that ear is at beginning dent, so up here, R5, then you look at what the moisture in that kernel is. It might be 60%, but I look at this column right here, dry matter. There's only 45% dry matter in that kernel. That means even at dent, so dent is about 30 days till maturity, and that can shift a little bit with hybrids and environments and stuff like that, but about 30 days on average. So you think, hey, my corn it's close, it's done, it's finished, it looks good. There's still about half or more than 50% of the dry matter left to go. So yields can still change, even at R5. They've done studies where they looked at frost. Frost comes through, my plant is at beginning R5. Complete death of that plant, you can still lose upwards of 30% yield. And where's that coming from? It's just the weight of those kernels. That kernel just wasn't able to reach its full potential in terms of size and weight, even at R5. Another important aspect about R5, if you ever split an ear in half, when it's dented, you start to see the milk line. So the milk line is just kind of gives you an idea of how much that kernel is progressing. So half milk line, we switch back over here. This is looking at quarter milk line, half milk line, 3/4 milk line. Okay, half milk line, now we're 90% dry matter. Complete plant death, there's 5% yield, not as much. So you think about, okay, when stresses come in or it gets really hot or if we had an early frost, you know, understanding where that crop was at and where that milk line was at, you can kind of get an estimate of maybe how much the weight of those kernels were impacted. So I like sharing that because the milk line can kind of give you an estimate of how close that crop is to maturity. You know, I work with some folks that irrigate, an often easy way to figure out when am I going to shut off my irrigation, looking at the milk line on those ears. That can give you an estimate of how many days away are we until we reach maturity, and maintaining that moisture in that crop to maturity is important. So when I think about grain fill, what we got to look at is just how is the weight of the kernels basically developed after tassel. So you go through tassel, that crop is pollinated, we fertilize the ovules on that ear, and then what we go through is called the grain fill, but also looking at linear kernel filling rate. That crop right behind you is smack in the middle of linear kernel filling rate. So it's filling kernels. So right after pollination, what happens is that the kernels go through what is called a lag phase. They're not Their size isn't changing much, but they're filling with endosperm cells. Endosperm cells is starch. That's all it is. And it's starting to determine, it's starting to tell that kernel, what is my volume capacity going to be? What is my potential as a kernel? And they've actually done research. I've talked to the grad students that have done this. They actually went under microscopes and counted endosperm cells in kernels to figure out how they change with management. In management, nitrogen is one, can change how many endosperm cells I have in my kernel. So that's what goes through that first 10 days after pollination. And then we go through linear kernel filling rate, where that kernel is filling with moisture. If you ever pull an ear at R3, that milk stage, you stick your fingernail in it and moisture sprays everywhere. That kernel is filling with moisture. And that linear kernel filling rate is it's filling with moisture. It has its endosperm cells. It's starting to determine, okay, how big am I going to be? What is my potential? So if you look at this graph, which is dry weight of a single kernel on the y-axis here, and days after flowering on the x-axis, what would happen if this line kept going up? Probably the dry matter over here would keep going up, correct? So we want to understand, how do we maybe manipulate that? Can we manipulate that? Can we manage that? How does that change with some of the management that we're able to do in that overall crop? Because if we can extend grain fill, yields are better. And why are yields better? Because the kernels are heavier at that point in time. So we wanted to look at that. So we did that. So I'll show you some data from 2022 and 2023. Very similar type graph that I showed you, where we tracked linear kernel filling rate. And we looked at two different management practices. One, just no disease control. The other one is we sprayed a fungicide at R1, R2, mostly R1 at this, right at tassel. We had tar spot in both years, so tar spot was our predominant disease at this location over the last couple of years. And I had a grad student. She recently defended her master's, but part of her grad school, and this is part of grad school, you got to do very exciting things. She pulled ears every single week after pollination, even when they're this big. And she used tiny little tweezers to extract those kernels from those ears and weigh them. We took the moisture from them, and we used little analytical scales to get very precise measurements to measure those kernels. And we did that every single week. I say we, she and my students did that every week. It's a lot of work, but it gives us an idea of basically we're tracking this various plants right next to each other. And we tag these plants right after we plant, so we can track them throughout the entire season. And each one of these points is an individual ear, and we have, I think, 15 to 20 kernels that we extracted from each one of those ears, from different places in that ear, to be able to track that. So we do that every single week, and what we're trying to do is basically understand, when does the dry matter in that kernel start to plateau, and then when does it reach maturity. And what we found is that you look at the blue line. Blue line would be no fungicide at all. It was a control. We had tar spot come in. We did not control that disease. It took about 50 days, so 50 days after pollination, until it started to plateau with dry matter. That's not quite black layer. Black layer is a little bit longer, but it started to plateau in its dry matter. And that was about 270 milligrams per individual kernel. So if you took a little individual kernel, weighed that individual kernel, dried it down and weighed it, 270 milligrams for that kernel. The fungicide, which is the orange line, so the first thing we noticed with the orange line, so this is the same hybrid, side by side, same planting date, same everything, same field, is that it kept going a little bit longer. So to reach that maximum, so we use statistics to determine that maximum, it was about 54 days. So just 4 days of a grain fill extension, 4 days. That resulted in about 30 milligrams per more per kernel in dry matter. And what did that track to? Here's our yield data over here. 191 was the control. We had a little bit more stressful conditions in 2022. 191, you look at the R1 fungicide, 214. So even just 4 days and a few milligrams in those kernels, we're able to increase yield. And on average, it was about 20 bushel or so, range from, I would say, from 10 to 20 bushel across the board, and a lot of the replicated plots that we do. this data. But just that small extension, we're able to, one, extend the grain fill, and then when we're able to extend the grain fill, we did see a higher yield. And we adjust these for moisture. One challenge with fungicides is we often see about a half a point to a point more moisture. We actually do adjust for that in this data. We're just strictly looking at what the dry matter is in that grain. But you look at disease. So disease, you say, that's only 3-4% disease. We're just looking at one leaf. We're looking at the ear leaf. We're also monitoring the upper canopy. And that's a function of the coverage and the amount of lesions on that leaf at that point in time. So even 4 or 5% severity, we typically expect a fairly significant yield response from fungicide at that point in time when we're taking these disease ratings. So when we're able to, one, we have disease, and tar spot was the big one. We had northern corn leaf blight, a little bit of gray leaf spot, but tar spot was the biggest one. We were able to reduce disease with that fungicide down to 0.6%. So that's about 1-2 lesions on a leaf. I should have brought those pictures. We had side-by-side pictures where you could take a picture of the leaf with the fungicide and without it. It controlled that disease like it's supposed to. And it's basically maintaining the upper canopy of that plant. Maintaining the health, the green leaf area. That plant is just still photosynthesizing, and it's extending that grain fill. So grain fill in corn, often, we think about maturity in corn and hitting black layer in corn. One of the ways it starts to determine black layer is obviously the maturity and the growing degree days and stuff like that. But it also looks at that kernel, or that corn plant can sense what's the rate of those photosynthates moving through the cob and through the kernel. And we have stressful conditions, right? You think about disease, what does it do? Disease overtakes the green leaf area in a plant. High temperatures, what does high temperatures do? It can shut down the upper portion of that canopy. One of the things we saw in Indiana with 96-degree heat last couple days is we saw fields where the top portion of the canopy is starting to senesce. We want the bottom portion of the canopy to senesce and move up, not starting at the top portion of the canopy. So when that happens, is that corn plant, it actually starts to sense what the transfer of those carbohydrates, the assimilates going from that plant into that kernel. And it can kind of sense that rate, what's going on there. When a corn plant's working a lot harder, or if it's lost a lot of its green leaf area, disease can do this, nutrient deficiencies can do this. High temperatures, high nighttime temperatures where that plant's working really hard, is that it often will black layer and it'll reach its maximum or starting to slow its dry matter accumulation a lot sooner than if it stayed cooler, or if we had adequate moisture, if we had adequate fertility, if we had disease control. It goes a little bit slower. When it goes a little bit slower, it goes longer. And that's the main thing that we found with these trials, is that grain fill was a little bit longer. And the fact that it was a little bit longer tracked to a little bit more weight in those kernels, a little bit more yield. And that was 2022. 2023, similar story. In terms of the grain fill response, different story in terms of what the overall management and the crop was that year. One, planting date was a little bit different, much earlier. Yields were much higher in 2023. So some of the best yields I saw in the state of Indiana were last year. We had plots of this research farm that replicated 300 bushel across the way. And it was often grain fill. We had outstanding grain fill conditions in West Lafayette last year in central Indiana. But we saw a very similar response. So grain fill was just longer in general. So the control was about 56 days versus 50. Kernel weights were much higher, but very similar response. So we saw about 4 or 5 day extension. Yield difference was not as big in terms of the fungicide. Well, I think one of the big reasons why is the control. We just didn't have the level of control in 2023 than we did in 2022. Big reason for that is disease came in later on us. I had some trials right next to this trial where we sprayed at R3, same hybrid, right next door it. This one we saw 10 bushel, tar spot again, came in a little bit later. We saw 18 bushel in the plot where we sprayed a little bit later. So I think that was a function of it. But again, very similar story, right? So 56 days, without a fungicide, 61 days with the fungicide. So again, we're still seeing that extension, but yields were a little bit higher. Overall weights were a little bit higher across the board, and about 10 bushel. So we're seeing often a range, about 3 to 5 day extension, and anywhere from, I would say, 10 to 20 bushel in that overall response. And this is something we're still working on. This year, we're adding some fertility aspects to it as well. Think about potassium and boron and nitrogen and different aspects from fertility to see how it changes. Another piece of this is hybrid. So I get this question a lot is, would you expect a similar response like this in a hybrid that has much smaller kernel numbers versus a hybrid that has much bigger kernel numbers, or bigger kernel weights, bigger kernels? And probably this hybrid that has bigger kernels might have more of a response to this than, say, a hybrid that has more kernel numbers, but the depth isn't as big. Think about when kernel numbers are being determined a little bit earlier in the season during vegetative growth. So we haven't looked at that, but that is on my list of next things to look at, is different hybrids, because I'd be really curious how this hybrid versus this hybrid and how this data can differ between those two hybrids. The big moral story of this is that we were able to kind of track that when we were able to protect that canopy, maintain that overall health of that crop a little bit later. You got to be careful with that, because I've seen where you manage it too much and it does not dry down at all. You run into dawn issues, and I had farmers in northern Indiana that were calling me that said my corn will not black layer and it will not dry down. And we had some of the worst dawn issues in northern Indiana last year. So we got to be careful with that. So you kind of have to find that balance. But we're able to determine, hey, if we manage that upper portion of the canopy, if we maintain that green leaf area of that crop, grain fill is extended. And when grain fill is extended, that results in a little bit bigger kernels, but predominantly heavier kernels. So dry matter in those grain, and that can track with a little bit higher yields. So back to understanding, we do a lot of management up front, you do in-season management applications, but there's still a lot of yield left to go in corn. I always say corn, you gotta almost manage it throughout the entire year, because it's determining yield in different ways throughout the entire season.